Pleased actually to welcome Sonia Anisimova to speak to us today, not least because Sonia and I go back a way. She was actually an MA student who studied with me at King's about 3 years ago now, took my master's module, the Entente War, brought a Russian perspective to that study of coalition strategy in the First World War, and out of her work on that module, her master's thesis on Russian strategy in 1916 came her doctoral subject, which is Russia's relations with her Entente partners in the First World War, which she is studying at St Andrews University under the supervision of Professor Hugh Strawn. It's also a first for us because Sonia is actually speaking to us from Russia, and possibly the first time we've had a speaker from abroad. Some ways, although the restrictions of the coronavirus pandemic are annoying, it also gives us opportunities that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sonia, who will address us. The question and answer session at the end, of course, will be conducted through the chat function. So if you have a question, I will invite questions at the end. If any concerns you have during the course of the lecture, technical issues perhaps, raise them through the chat function and I'll see if I can address them. But for now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for this introduction. And let me just start my slides so you can see also the topic of today's talk. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me tonight for the talk dedicated to Russia's role in the Salonika campaign negotiations in 1916. So much has been written on Salonika negotiations already, but there's still some aspects that of the creation of the Macedonian front that can benefit from more attention and research. And Russia's role in it is one of them. So I hope that today's seminar would be just another step towards a more comprehensive and multinational discussion of the Entente strategy in the Balkans in the First World War. This particular paper is a part of my postgraduate research that I'm undertaking at the University of St Andrews, and that is entitled Russia's Military Strategy and the Entente in the First World War, and it's also a continuation of my master's project that I completed at King's under the supervision of Professor Philpott, to whom I want to extend my special thanks tonight for running this seminar in this uncertain and strange time of coronavirus. But before I begin, I have a little disclaimer, because my research, as I'm sure some of yours as well, was disrupted by the coronavirus crisis, and I did not have the access to French and British archives, and I did not have a chance to explore the inter-allied communication, so direct communication between Russia and France and Britain, as thoroughly as I would like to. So this paper today is based on published sources mostly, and Russian sources that I was able to access in archives in Russia, and therefore would like to concentrate more, not on direct communication between Russian allies, but on Russian view on Macedonian front, and the logic behind Russia's position on the Macedonian front, and how the consideration of the Russia's plans and Russia's position on Macedonia affected the Allies' decision. So let's begin then. Just one more mention. So this is a work in progress. This is a part of my ongoing postgraduate research. So I would be very grateful for your comments and questions in the end of the seminar, and suggestions maybe as well. So the year 1915 wasn't very successful for the Allies. The Dardanelles venture ended up in failure. The stalemate of the Western Front was still ongoing, and Russia suffered a severe blow in the summer of 1915, losing most of its Polish territory and forced to retreat inland for more than 1,000 kilometers. The Great Retreat brought a significant change in Russian high command. Nicholas II assumed the supreme command himself and appointed General Alexeyev the commander of the Western Front, as his chief of staff, of head of Stavka, as I will refer to him. Stavka was the Russian headquarters located in Mogilov in modern-day Belarus. And Alexeyev brought a new team to Stavka. With him came General Pustovoitenko and General Borisov. Borisov was old comrade of Alexeyev from Nicholas Academy of General Staff, and despite having no formal role in Stavka, he had a significant influence on Russia's military strategy at the time. And I want to draw your attention to them specifically because these are the people that were behind Russian planning at the time, and they will play a significant role in my story later today. So the first big challenge that Russia faced after the coalition faced after the Russia's retreat and the change in Russian high command was the Central Powers offensive in Serbia that began on 6 October 1915. In the first year of the war, Serbs managed to keep the Austro-Hungarians from most of Serbian territory, but in 1915, poorly equipped Serbian army was unable to withstand the pressure from the combined German and Austro-Hungarian forces that were later joined by Bulgarian army. So the offensive began on 6 October. By 9th of October, Serbian army abandoned Belgrade, and the Entente had to react fast in order to save what was at the time its only allies in the Balkans. The German attack, however, and the German-Austria attack, however, did not come as a complete surprise to the allies. And because the weeks prior to the attack and weeks prior before Bulgaria declared general mobilization, Allied intelligence already detected military preparations at the Serbo-Bulgarian border. And despite swearing loyalty to the Serbs, the Entente did not undertake an active action to prevent the said attack. And the French and British were busy with the coming offensives in Artois and Champagne, and the Russians were trying to repel German breakthrough at Svinchonis in Lithuania. So on 24th of September, Stavka suggested tentatively that the Serbs attack the Bulgarians before the Bulgarian mobilization was complete, but the British blocked this suggestion, hoping that at this stage, Bulgaria was still they still can swing Bulgaria's allegiance in favor of the Entente. But at the same time, the Allies realized that they could not leave Serbia to be crushed by the Central Powers, but could not agree who would carry out the relief operation. In late September, the Greek port of Salonika was chosen as the platform of the future offensive that would help Serbian army, but Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, wasn't ready to spare any troops from the Western Front, especially after the offensive in Artois began, and the British military command was equally reluctant to send the troops on another venture in the east, despite initially agreeing to help the French to prevent internal political crisis in France. So, looking for manpower, the French and the British turned their gaze to Russia as a source of manpower for the newly created Macedonian front, and argued that given the claims that Russia had for the Straits and for the Balkans after the war, she had to send the troops to help Serbia send the troops to Salonika to help Serbia alongside other allies. But the mood in Mogilov, the mood in Stavka was quite different, because Russian high command felt that in 1915, they shouldered the burden of the German advance, and it was now a turn of France and Britain to serve the common cause. Don't get me wrong, they were very happy that the Allies are opening this front in Salonika, because Russia understood that they had to help, the Allies had to help to serve, and Russia had a political interest in it, particularly because Serbia was its diplomatic protege, but they didn't want to do it themselves. Despite Joffre's claims that the attacks in Artois and Champagne helped to relieve Russian front, Eastern Front, as we know it, in fact, the Stavka didn't really feel the impact of the Allied offensives in the West, because the Germans were able to hold the line in France, and they were able to launch few attacks on Russia at the same time, and they also move an army to help the Austro-Hungarians in Serbia. Partially, this attitude of Russian high command towards the Western Front came from the lack of knowledge what kind of fighting the French and the British were undertaking in France and Belgium. So only in November 1915, Stavka actually sent a special mission to the Western Front to observe French army fighting techniques. And after they received the reports from this mission, they were able to grasp the nature of the trench warfare better. But until then, they were very suspicious. They were even suspicious of the French and the British commitment to the cause and commitment to help Russia, because the offensives in the West didn't really bring the coveted relief in the East. So the Allies decided to use the Russian manpower to persuade Russia to send the men to Salonika front, because they couldn't release any men from the Western Front. And the Allies had different communications channels with Russia, including strictly military channels that went through representatives in military headquarters. They also had diplomatic channels that went through ambassadors and head of the foreign affairs ministries in different countries. And finally, they had the direct line of communications between the heads of state, and the former line of communications was usually used just for the most important matters. So the direct line between the head of states were usually used to resolve the matters that were quite pressing and on which their headquarters were unable to come to an agreement. So in this case, in case of Salonika, the French used all three lines of communications, but it was the latest one. So it was the direct line between President Poincaré, and Nicholas II that actually did the trick and made the Russians to concede and initially agree to send troops to Salonika. But the French started to they brought up the question of sending Russian troops to Salonika only on 1st October of 1915. Those of you that are familiar with the timeline of the French Anglo-French negotiations on Salonika, you know that the initial negotiations started in late September, so about 10 days before the French actually communicated the first request to send the troops to Salonika to the Russian headquarters. But initial reply of the Russians was no, that they suffered a severe blow by the German army and they were unable to spare any troops from the Eastern Front. The French continued to bombard Russians with requests, and by 12th October 1915, Nicholas II actually agreed to create an infantry brigade to be sent to Salonika to help the Allies. Chief of Staff General Alexeyev wasn't very keen on that decision, because he justly noticed that one infantry brigade wouldn't really make a lot of impact, make a huge difference in Salonika. And on 22nd of October, after Nicholas II returned to Mogilov, Alexeyev managed to persuade him to divert this brigade to Southwestern Front to use it to help Serbia otherwise. So there were, on 20th of October, even actually when the brigade was still on the way to Archangel to be sent to Salonika, Alexeyev and Borisov they wrote a draft telegram to be sent to Joffre outlining alternatives that Russia, 6 possible alternatives on how Russia could have helped Serbia instead of sending troops to Salonika. Indeed, sending troops to Salonika was one of the worst military options for Russia to help Serbia, because the troops would have been sent from Archangel to Salonika through North Sea and around Italy, around Greece, and then eventually to Salonika, they would be cut off from the Russian army, and they would completely rely on the supplies from the French and the British. So Alexei was also very skeptical from of the Poincaré's and Joffre's idea that the appearance of the Russian soldiers in Salonika would sway Bulgarian soldiers to the Entente side, that the Bulgarians wouldn't fight against Russian soldiers, and that sending Russian soldiers to Salonika would have had this symbolical impact and symbolical importance to the Salonika front. So Alexeyev didn't agree with that. So instead, he suggested the following alternative: an offensive in Galicia. Here, I outlined them here. The green lines. So the green lines are the alternatives suggested by the Russians, and the pink line are the options suggested by the French. So sending directly to Salonika or sending troops to Serbia via the Danube. That came a week later, after a couple of weeks later, the suggestion to send the troops to Salonika. So first was an offensive in Galicia. Second was reinforcement of Romanian army through Suceava. So that was in case Romania joined the Entente, then the Russian army would reinforce them, and they would strike Bulgaria to divert the troops from Serbia. Another option was, if Romania remains neutral, then Russian army would be able to cross Romania and attack Bulgaria with their own forces. And then there were three options that involved amphibious operations against Bulgaria or Turkey. One was to land in Varna and attack Bulgaria from the sea and attack towards inner parts of Bulgaria towards Tinovo. And was option to land in Burgas, is a south the southern part of Bulgarian coast, and then attack Turkey, try to cut Bulgaria from Turkey and help the allies in the Dardanelles, or to land in Turkey and just to help the allies in the Dardanelles. So the last option was the resurrection of the plan that came around in the early 1915, but wasn't completed because Russia was attacked by the Germans in spring 1915, that later led to the great retreat of the Russian forces. So by the time Borisov and Alexeyev drafted their telegram, the French also realized that maybe sending the troops directly to Salonika wasn't the best idea, because it would take so much time. So they suggested to send the troops via the Danube, or or maybe try to sway the Romania and join the Romanian forces in attacking Bulgaria. And for the French, this suggestion was quite important, because the perspective of the joint offensive with the Russian became for them a bargaining chip in negotiations with the British, because the British were having, at the time, second on sending troops. This is coming, so it's a second half of October 1915 we're talking about. But the suggestion of sending troops via the Danube, so the Joffre suggestion, was quickly rejected, because Russia didn't have adequate means to carry out such an operation. They didn't have enough transport means to just bring the troops up the Danube towards Belgrade, and they were not sure about whether Romania would allow this. So this option was not on the table. Then came two options that relied on Romania heavily, as you can see on the list before you. So Romania was still sitting on the fence, and with Bulgaria joining the Central Powers, the Bulgarian and so the Romanian and the Greece, they got they gained importance, and their allied diplomats, especially, they were trying to join the Entente. And the British, in that matter, they promised to the Romanian government to send 500 troops to Salonika. This number came from 200,000 French and British troops, plus 3 Serbian troops, and they also promised to furnish Russia with 500. So Russia could create a special army in the southwest, so on the border with Romania, to help Romanian army to attack Bulgaria. So the Romanian, these promises didn't persuade the Greek government because they were sent to Greek Romanian government simultaneously. So the Greek remained neutral, but the Romanian prime minister informed the British ambassador that Romania would join the Entente, but only if would be able to send 500,000 troops to the Balkans, and Russia would guarantee 500,000 troops on the Russian-Romanian border. So effectively, Romania wanted to have 1 million troops, million allied troops on its borders to join the Entente to help the Serbians and to attack Bulgaria, so which really sounded quite important. The Russian High Command really welcomed the possibility of receiving extra 500 rifles. So just a quick note on this 500,000 rifles story, because as you might know, this idea came from the Lloyd George initiative in late October. So because they were saying we don't want to help Serbia, and the French were still unsure of how many troops they're prepared to fight in the Salonika, so that we can use Russian forces, and Russia suffered from munitions crisis, so we can send them 500 rifles to create a special army to do so. They kept on this promise, but later, so this will play out actually later in the Russian, British, and Russian Russo allied negotiations in December 1915, and even later, even in February and March 1916, because it would obviously take time to the Allies to find 5,000 rifles and then to ship them to Russia. And it turned out that the British did not mean to 100,000 rifles by themselves, and 300,000 rifles were supposed to came from Italy, which they did eventually. But these were all types of Vesely rifles. The Russians were unable to use at the front, so they used them in the training camps, and they sent other more newer rifles to the front. And this fact actually jeopardized Russian-Italian negotiations in March 1916, because Russian representative, I'm not sure, so there are different evidence, so apparent whether he was drunk or not, but he told the Italians that they didn't say this to the British, but he told the Italians that they rifle rubbish, and that led to a small diplomatic incident in March 1916. So the promise of Lloyd George actually eventually led to a diplomatic incident between Russian and Italian representatives in March 1916. I thought it was quite a curious fact. But let's return to the Russians' options to help Serbia. So Romania wanted 1 million men on its borders to as a condition to help the Bulgarians. So Alexeyev justly warned Nicholas II that is very improbable, and also that Romania's conditions would progressively change as the Allies fulfilled them. More to it, Romania declined the suggestion of letting the armies through the Bruja to attack Bulgaria. So 2 Romanian options by the end of October 1915 were already off the table. Then Russians decided to explore the Bulgaria's options. So they decided, if we can't go through Romania, let's attack Bulgaria directly. And this is when they decided to explore amphibious operation to seize Varna or Burgas. So Russian High Command was persuaded even before the war that the war would be decided on the battlefields of Germany and Austria. So they didn't really devote much attention to preparing for any campaign in the Balkans, let alone the amphibious operation against the Bulgarian coast. Some of the Baltic Fleet officers were still working on potential amphibious operation 1913, 1914, but it was meant to capture the straits, and it was still not very well prepared. So when the idea for the amphibious operation against Bulgaria came around, the Baltic Fleet lacked the transport capacity, lacked the preparation techniques. Russia lacked the skilled infantry to conduct the operation, and the appearance of 3 German submarines in the Black Sea was and finally the appearance of the 3 German submarines in the Black Sea was the last straw that persuaded the commanders of the Baltic Fleet and the Navy to brand this operation as non-feasible. So with the Bulgarian option also not on the table, Russia decided to go for an attack against Austro-Hungarians in Galicia. And that only came in late November 1915. So the decision-making process was incredibly slow. So in first half of October, the Romania options disappeared. In the second half of October and early November, the Bulgarian options disappeared, and finally they had to prepare for the attack in Galicia, which actually took place, but in a month's time, in late December. It was already of little help to the Serbian army, which already retreated through Albanian mountains, and if it had any impact, it just bought some time for the Serbian army to regroup and land their evacuation transport provided by the Allies. Not to say that this eventual Galician operation in December was very costly for Russia, that suffered more than 50,000 casualties, and the Russian troops were unable to advance on for more than a few kilometers into enemy's territory. But I want to reiterate here that all of these options were conditional, provided that the Allies would attack on Salonika. So Russia was very keen that the Allies would keep Salonika, and Russia and the Allies would carry simultaneous offensive against Austria-Hungary to help Serbia, to help to relieve pressure on Serbia. So when the Allied expeditionary force in Salonika was paralyzed by the political disagreements between the British and the French, Alexeyev was very disappointed and questioned the Allied commitment to the cause. Interestingly, that feeling of Alexeyev that Salonika is much more important than just a small secondary operation to help Serbia, and it can be used for a simultaneous offensive for Russia and the Allies, was exploited by the French representative Marquis de la Guiche, that in October 1915 sent a letter to Alexeyev saying that Salonika should not be regarded as strictly secondary campaign because it had the potential to for a bigger and larger strategic operations, and the battles and that will be fought in Macedonia will have consequences on the whole outcome of the war. At the moment, I'm still unclear whether General de la Guiche wrote this letter on his own as his own initiative, or he was actually suggested to do so by General Joffre. But in any case, that particular letter influenced and sort of like encouraged a different approach that Russia adopted towards Salonika in 1915, because whilst because this in combination with the suggestion of the French command to hold an Allied conference where a new plan of offensive 16 would be discussed, gave the Russian high command an idea that the Salonika can be used as a launching ground for a big combined Allied strategic offensive in 1916. I'll just skip that slide and go directly, because we only have about 15 minutes left. I'll just go directly to this idea of the combined strategic offensive that the Russian High Command came up with in November 1915. So whilst they were planning how to relieve Serbia, how to help Serbia, and how to help the Allied offensive in Salonika, if that would have happened, Alexeyev and Borisov came up with an idea of a simultaneous offensive from the Eastern Front and the Salonika. So they put forward this original plan for the Allied conference that was supposed to take place in November 1915, but would eventually take place on 6th to 8th of December 1915 in Chantilly, in the French headquarters. It is usually referred as Alexeyev's plan of Alexeyev's project. And it can be found in archives in two versions. The first version is just a strict telegram that the Alexeyev sent to the Allied headquarters. This version can be found in Russian as well as British and the French archives. And the second version, which is a little more curious, is the draft version that contains not only the outline of the offensive, but also a second part which explores the logic behind this suggestion. I also have a little note on the authorship of this project, because we usually refer to refer it as Alexeyev project, because the final version, so the telegram that was communicated to the Allies, was signed by General Alexeyev. But the draft is written by General Borisov, and now I'm able to confirm, after comparing Borisov's handwriting, because this note is not signed, but I was able to look at Borisov's handwriting in Belgrade, where he died. So I explored some of what remained of his personal archive. So I know I have the sample of Borisov handwriting and the handwriting of this note, and I can confirm that the authorship of this project actually belongs to Borisov, which makes quite a lot of sense. And I will talk about it in a second. So what was this project about? So it was a list of 8 points that suggested 2 simultaneous offensives that would be carried out by combined Franco-Anglo-Italian army of no less than 10 infantry corps from Salonika, and by the Russian force of roughly the same size from Galicia in direction of Budapest, with the ultimate goal of separating Germany and Austria from Hungary and Bulgaria. So this is a hand-drawn map of the Allied offensive suggested by Alexeyev and Borisov that can be found in the Russian archives, that can be found in the draft itself. So this, the arrows on the left are the arrows that designate the transportation of the troops. So the Alexeyev and Borisov suggested that the transported from the Western Italian front to Salonika, and then they will carry out a simultaneous operations with the Russians that would attack Austria-Hungary from Galicia. So the result, as Borisov put it in the draft, was to cut the Central Powers in half. And to justify this, Borisov recalled the action of the 6th Anti-Napoleon coalition in 1813. So according to him, Napoleon in 1813, like Kaiser Wilhelm in 1915, had the advantage of the central position. But Alexander I of Russia deprived Napoleon of that advantage by uniting Russian Austrian forces at Trachenberg and striking Napoleon's army. So in 1915, the Allies should do the same thing. They need to deprive Germany of the advantage of its central location, unite their forces, and strike the Germany in its underbelly. This is the quote from the draft itself. What is interesting, though, is that Borisov was not the only one to use Napoleon references from Napoleonic wars to justify the offensive in Salonika. In 1915, General Franco d'Esprit who developed one of the first plans of offensive in Salonika even before the campaign began. So he, while suggesting his plan, he was also referencing Napoleonic wars and quoting from Alan Palmer's book, The Gardens of Salonika, he was mesmerized by the thought of the great cavalry advance across the open plain of Hungary. So it's quite a similar idea to that of Borisov. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to locate the initial draft of this Franco d'Esprit plans because Alan Palmer quotes from the Franco d'Esprit's biography of 1949, but the biography doesn't really have a list of doesn't have a proper reference for this. So lacking and the references to Napoleonic warfare probably come from the lack of experience of coalition warfare. So for the First World War strategist, Napoleonic warfare was the example of the coalition warfare, so they had to refer to it by justifying the coalition action. To justify the coalition actions, not to say that the Napoleonic warfare was the war of maneuver, and the Russian as well as some allies strategies, they strive war of maneuver, and this what it says about Russian also planning is that by 1915 they were not quite well equipped, to understand the trench warfare that's already in the Western Front. This is something that already mentioned, however. The choice of the Belgrade Budapest line, because if we look at this map, this is the map of the Russian official history of war that was published in 1920. So this outlines the directions of the proposed offensive from Salonika, from Romania, and from Galicia towards Budapest. And then the Allied forces were supposed to join in Budapest and eventually advance to Berlin. This is something that you can only find in a draft. Of course, Alexeyev would not allow for Borisov to share his thoughts of advancing to Berlin with their allies. But this idea came actually from Borisov and Alexeyev's previous experience, because Alexeyev served in Kiev military district that was later developed in the southwestern front of Russia that faced Austria-Hungary. And Alexeyev was behind the mobilization plan A. It was a war plan that Russia created in 1912 that was supposed to that suggested that Russia throws most of its forces against Austria-Hungary. So the idea of Alexeyev, however, Alexeyev did not deny that Germany was the principal enemy of the Entente. So, and as he put it in a telegram to a Russian representative in French headquarters, Zhilinsky, in January 1916, he said that the goal of the Entente was the gradual construction and encirclement of Germany. So to strike Austria-Hungary was to deprive Germany of its advantage, but Germany was the main goal of the Entente. To a certain extent, his idea actually is similar to the Lloyd George's idea of knocking out the props. So he suggested to knock out Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria to strike Germany. So Borisov clearly overestimated the influence of Russia when he suggested this project, because also in the draft he suggested that Russia takes the lead in the command of the coalition. But Alexeyev was more pragmatic, because he wrote to Sazonov that without expecting the suggestions outlined in the note to be accepted, I still ask for your assistance in explaining through our ambassadors to our allied governments the importance of being strong on the Balkan Peninsula and sending a decisive blow from there to destroy Austria. So actually, it seems that the plan that was suggested by Alexeyev was the plan of maximum offensive, but he actually hoped that by suggesting that, he would persuade the allies to keep the troops in Salonika. He was not expecting them to actually launch this offensive, but rather to persuade them that the Salonika has a potential that's a much bigger potential that the Allies previously thought. And he lamented the attitude of the British Chief of Imperial General Staff that considered Salonika to be a secondary operation. He actually called General Murray narrow-minded and egotistical by deciding to, by advocating to evacuate Salonika in December 1915. So why Russia suggested such an odd plan that even now many historians describe as grandiose and improbable? Actually, Poincaré, when he referred to this plan, the person who was actually behind involving Russia in the Salonika campaign, so he wrote about this plan, what imagination at work. So it sounded quite not non-realizable, so inexecutable, as Joffre has branded it. And I think the answer is actually threefold. The first is the theory, because Alexeyev and Borisov, people behind this plan, they adhered to Suvorov's, General Suvorov's strategic principle. And this strategic principle encouraged bold and daring tactic. Actually, in 1913, Borisov wrote a book called Bold and Daring Tactic, that he believed was the base of his work with Alexeyev. So Suvorov's logic encouraged a perpetual offensive. So he effectively demanded initiative, audacity, and control over the troops. So strategically, it meant to take action before your enemy does. So that, therefore, before Germany takes action, Alexeyev suggested that the Allies strike Austria from Salonika and Galicia. And second aspect is the perspective of the Russian command, because Russia was fighting multiple enemies on one continuous front. And that continuous front was linked both to the Serbian front and to the Western front. And what was happening in France was affecting what was happening in the northern front of Russia. And what was happening in Serbia was affecting what was happening in southwestern front of Russia. So I think it was easier for Stavka to gauge this interconnectivity of different allied theaters of war. So as Alexeyev later explained in the note that he passed to British representative in Stavka Henry Williams in December 1915, that he said that considerations of British General Staff regarding the operation of the Allied army in the Balkans, that regard Allied operation in the Balkans as completely separate, isolated, and without connection and influence on the enterprise on the Allied force in the other theaters, without connection with the Allied forces in the other theaters are completely wrong. They do not at all touch upon some auxiliary actions, which in this situation we cannot neglect. So Salonika, almost from the beginning, almost from the initial suggestion to send Russian troops there, in Alexeyev's eyes, was a part of the coalition action and not a secondary theater. Yes, it became as a part to help, partially to help Serbia, but that later developed into a bigger strategic plan. And third is the pessimism, because actually this idea to help Serbia was described by Alexeyev as a actually desire not to help Serbia, but to help Russia as well, because Salonika was the sole point that allowed the communication of the Allies through Russia. Well, Serbia was before that, and Serbia was pinning down Austro-Hungarian army in the south that was preventing Austro-Hungarians to use these extra troops against Russia. Salonika was supposed to be the replacement of that. And when the Allies were decided not trying to take any active action there in November, December 1915, Alexeyev saw it as a threat to Russian security in the southwest. So I'll have to go back for a second. So in December 1915, just before the conference Chantilly started, the Russians were informed that the British decided to decided to evacuate Salonika. So this idea was floating around, and that was not taken very well by Alexei and Borisov. And I think the December 1915 is really the period that shows very well the Russian attitude towards Salonika, because Alexei and Borisov started to bombard the British, mostly the British. They were sending copies of their communications to the French headquarters as well, but the British were the target audience of their communications. And so they sent three quite detailed telegrams on 7th of December, 11th of December, 22nd of December to the chief of Imperial General Staff, advocating for the British to keep the troops in Salonika. They were trying to give political and strategic reasons why Salonika is so important. Strategically, as I described, it was already a strategic aspect I have already described. There was the idea that Salonika can be used for a major strategic operation of the Entente, and politically, it was the idea that it will prevent Romania from joining the Central Powers. Actually, on the 22nd of December, Alexei and Borisov sent a note that was painting quite a disastrous picture. What would happen if the British would evacuate Salonika? If the British would evacuate, the French evacuate, and then the Austria-Hungary would have some extra troops released that they can use in Galicia against Russia, and Romania would have to join the Central Powers, and then joined with Austria-Hungary, they will crush Russian Southwestern Front, and they will advance all the way to Kiev and later to, well, they didn't really put it that way, but they were implying that the Kiev is threatened, and if the Kiev is threatened, then Moscow and St. Petersburg are threatened as well. So by evacuating Salonika, the British could provoke the domino effect that would lead for Russia to leave the Allied war effort. But on 22nd of December, they actually didn't need to, or they already didn't have to send this communication, because on 10th of December, after the Chantilly conference, Kitchener came to Paris to meet with Joffre and Briand and agreed to leave British troops in Salonika for 5 more weeks, but making sure that no serious offensive was undertaken there. In early December, so whilst the Chantilly conference was ongoing, the British agreed that they will not evacuate Salonika, and that they couldn't allow the break with the French and the Russian high command. Actually, Keith Nielsen says that the stress of the Russian high command and this continuous telegrams and notes and communications that Russian high command was sending to the British was one of the tipping points that persuaded persuaded Kitchener and the War Committee to reevaluate their view of Salonika campaign. So just I think we have a few minutes for brief conclusions. So Russia encouraged the Allies to stay in Salonika from the very beginning of this campaign. So they really welcomed this prospect of Allies helping from Salonika, and even if Serbia would be knocked out of the war, Salonika would pin the Austro-Hungarian. The logic behind this was driven national interest, but it also coincided with their view as well. So the national interest pushed to suggest a simultaneous coalition action of international, multinational scale. And the desire of the multinational coalition action coincided with other allies' desire to improve their strategic coordination. And Alexeyev didn't get what he wanted, didn't get in from Salonika and Galicia at the same time. But what he got was that the British decided to stay, and the French obviously decided to stay in Salonika, and the allies managed to Allied offensive in 1916, but not Eastern and Western Front on the main fighting on. Thank you very much. I apologize. It was just a bit too. My initial text was a bit long, so I had to kind of cut out some bits of it as I went along. But thank you very much again for listening to me, and I would very happy to answer your questions now.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, I know I'm probably going to have to rewrite my lecture on Salonica a bit now. There's things that you've given very interesting insight into the sort of the dimension of Allied strategy at this time we don't really see. While other members of the seminar are thinking up questions, I will just probe you a bit on a couple of themes. Firstly, Borisov's plan, I suppose you must call it now, rather than Alexeyev's plan. It strikes me as interesting that, and I think you were agreeing or suggesting this, it is slightly fanciful at this stage in the war. It's couched in Napoleonic terms, and it's unrealistic. You might be able to get to run your cavalry around the great Hungarian plain, but you've actually got to get them there first, and that means getting them through the Balkan Mountains or through potentially a neutral country or through the Carpathians, Galicia. I mean, this isn't really going to work, is it? And I think the French see that at Chantilly, they reject it straight away. But why is Borisov still thinking in these grand conceptual strategic terms?
Thank you very much for this question. So Borisov had a very special relations with Napoleon. So lots of contemporaries describe him as a bit mad because he was obsessed with the correspondance de Napoleon. So he always refers to it like, I've been reading his correspondence, Borisov's correspondence at different stages of his life, and he's quite obsessed with it. This is the first why Napoleon, because he had a personal connection with him. That's the first part of my answer. And the second answer is that yes, I didn't include that map in my presentation, but if you see the map of the relief of both Balkans and Galicia, you think it's completely mad because yes, you have to fight your way across the mountains. And Russia already failed to fight their way across the mountains in winter 1914. But if you think of it, it's not just Russia's fault, because this idea of launching a simultaneous offensive from Salonika and Galicia, is it that different from the idea that you can strike Turkey from the Dardanelles? That you can launch a big scale offensive from the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus at the same time? So I think that just Russian strategic thinking is it comes around a bit slower. So the learning curve, as we sometimes refer to it, is a bit slower because Russian fighting and the fighting on the Eastern Front, it kind of it freezes into the stalemate, it freezes into the trench warfare by the end of 1915. So it takes about a year longer than on the Western Front. So I think their progress and the progress of their thinking and the progress of their strategic thinking as well is taking longer than on the Western Front. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this grandiose plan is that different than some suggestions that were floating around in the West.
I might offer one observation that, of course, Russia's last great war was fought against Napoleon, and it was a success. And that's why the mindset might still be in the times of the empire. The books they read, their military treatises are Napoleonic in the same way that people argue that the French strategic thinking is Napoleonic. Until the end of 1914, they suddenly realised, actually, war's different. We've got to think it again. But also, I think my other observation is actually, leaving aside getting to Budapest, the campaigns that the Russians have been fighting in Poland are actually quite Napoleonic in the fact they have been much more mobile than the campaigns in the West. So maybe they think that we can do to the Austrians what the Germans will do to us. And when Brusilov strikes, to a certain extent, he does. So maybe the Galician bit is practical for Russian forces, but I don't think they understand the Salonika bit.
Oh, definitely not. I don't think they don't, even with the amphibious operation in the Straits that was sometimes brought up during the war, it turns out they didn't really have good maps of the Turkish coast to launch this operation. They didn't have good maps of Bulgarian coasts to launch an amphibious operation against Bulgaria. So it's grand planning, but when it comes to the technical realization of these plans, it's quite a lot of flaws that could be found there.
Yeah, well, we've seen that in all allies around this time of the war. The Italians, when they come into the war, the Dardanelles, the French offensives in Champagne and Artois. But actually, related to this, before I open up the questions, of course, parallel to Salonika starting, the Dardanelles are finishing. What is the Russian or Alexei's view on the fact that the Allies have failed to get through the Dardanelles?
Oh, he was very much against this operation in the first place. So his position on the Dardanelles is "I told you so," because it was Grand Duke's idea. So Grand Duke really liked the idea that Russia could take part in this as well, but then obviously the plans changed. But Alexeyev is, when he takes over command, Serbia is attacked, and Russia, the Germans broke through in Lithuania, and Russia has to patch up this break. He suggests that Russia offers Turkey separate peace. So there was a short period of time when Alexeyev was even thinking that they need to make peace with Turkey to release troops from the Caucasus so they can use it in the Balkans and in Bulgaria. So the Russia actually, I've been exploring it, just a little note, because I've been exploring it lately, the missions that Russia sent to different fronts to gather evidence and to share, to get some experience of different fronts. And when Russians get to Dardanelles, I think it's May 1915, they sent back the report saying it's going to fail. It's a failure. So I think they grasp the idea that this is not going to go well, and this is not going to end well. So they didn't really believe in this, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting aside, how the Allies assessed how each other's armies were doing. We have a lot of assessments of how the Allies sent missions to Russia and came back with bad reports. We don't have the Russians sending missions to the West and coming up with equally bad reports. That's an interesting...
Well, in the West, they're very impressed by the French fighting. They're very impressed by the French fight. They actually adopt lots of the French techniques, and the French share the instructions with the Russians, and they go through that learning together. But when it goes to the Dardanelles, they're not impressed, I'm afraid, at all.
Thank you. I'm very happy to open up questions to our online participants. If you'd like to post them through the Q&A function. Ewan Grant is asking, I've worked in Moldova and West Ukraine and Odessa. How did the Central Powers individually and collectively see the threat from the Salonika armies? Did they have big disagreements? I imagine they had a few small ones. So Ewan is asking how the Central Powers viewed the threat.
All right. I'm working mostly on the Allied perspective, but when it comes to the fighting on Salonika front, obviously the fact that there is lots of disagreements, and even on the technical level, there are different attitudes towards fighting, and there are different types of disciplines, different types of relation between officers and men, and the different languages that obviously jeopardize in a way the effectiveness of the fighting in Salonika. So I wouldn't be 100% sure about the Central Powers perspective on this, but I would say that they are aware about the multinational nature of the campaign in Salonika that was going there, so they wouldn't so they would consider it in their threat assessment, so as a lowering point in terms of threat. But there is a mention actually in, I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe it's in Ludendorff's memoirs, and this is something that Hugh Strawn mentioned to me, that the Germans are looking at Salonika in a similar way as Russians are looking at it. So they're saying that Salonika is weighting down the Austro-Hungarian armies. So this is something that pins Austro-Hungarian armies in the south. So in a way, it's a similar idea, because they spend troops, they have to use some troops in Salonika. And this, even though they might consider it to be a waste, they think, well, they pinning the Allies there, so 200,000 Allies troops are there. They're not in the Western Front, and it is better than nothing. So they also kind of look at it as a way to stretch the Allies' resources.
Yeah, I understand. Essentially, we see it as the Bulgarian front, but Austrian and German troops were there. Turkish troops at some point later, I understand. So it did engage all the Central Powers armies at the same time, having to mount a joint campaign, as we know from what happens. And as the Salonika campaign drags on for another 3 years, how difficult it is to mount that sort of multinational campaign. I welcome other questions.
No, so no more questions. Can
I then ask you to expand a bit about one thing strikes me about this? It's reactive and it's slow, so that essentially the Allies lose initiative and they never regain it. So whatever Russia wants to do or whatever the French want to do, they're always too little, too late. And there's a real failure of communications. You mentioned the 3 different communication channels between France and Russia, one of which ultimately worked. But do we have a problem that we don't have a centralized enough alliance to actually make any initiative, however grand the schemes, whatever range of resources that can actually be deployed to make these actually work, when the Central Powers have the advantage of interior lines and more centralized dynamic leadership?
Well, yes, you're right on this, and actually Russian Alexeyev would agree with you very much on this, because he was trying to advocate for creation of the War Council as early as October 1915. So I think the first suggestion that the French suggested to send Russian representative to Chantilly in early October 1915, and the Russians seized that idea and they suggest, let's make it permanent, and let's make it permanent for all the Entente powers, because they were feeling that they lack information, because especially Alexeyev, because Alexeyev already came as an experienced commander and a strategist, because the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich obviously had a different outlook, and his Stavka was mostly fighting in the national interest rather than international interest. They were happy to adhere to the common offensive, to the common principles of the Entente, but they were not ready to actually, sometimes to commit to the cause. They were saying some, they were always saying that they're ready to commit, but they were not ready to actually spare the efforts. Quite often you can find this situation. But Alexeyev comes as a person who wants to improve the communication, and therefore they were saying, look, we need to have a better coordination and communication. But unfortunately, he doesn't have the weight that they need to advocate this idea. So I think Russia on this stage, even though they grasp the idea that the Entente needs a better communication system or a better management system, they are unable to follow it through.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that Alexeyev's plan does not get anywhere at the Chantilly conference is there's no one there of sufficient weight to argue the case. It's only Zelinsky, am I right?
Yes,
the Russian ambassador. Yes.
And Zelinsky, I actually found an interesting description of Zelinsky as a Russian representative. He was described as a well-trained parrot. So as a person who says things that Stavka wanted him to say, but he was really unable to kind of take the initiative. So he was parroting what he was trained to say. So
he was a representative. He wasn't a dynamic contributor to discussion. I can appreciate that. While we've been talking, a flood of questions have come in, so I'm not sure I'm taking them in the right order, but I'll start with
Frederick.
Frederick, yes, sorry. Frederick asks, having discussed Borisov and Alexeyev, what is your opinion on the Tsar Nicholas II as a commander, and possibly you might also comment on his relationship with his chief of staff and his. Borisov was he head of operations, something like that? Or what's his
He
role?
didn't even have a formal rank until April 1916. So he was just a guy. He was retired before the war. He lived with Alexeyev's family, so he was not very well mentally. He spent some time in mental hospital. This is fact. And Alexeyev and his wife died in 1899, giving birth to his son. They both died, and after that, he had mental issues, and he was forced to retire. And he lived with Alexeyev. So he's a personal friend and a comrade that Alexeyev believed to be a great strategist. Actually, in many ways, Borisov's ideas are very original for his time. And Borisov he was a very strange figure in Stavka. He wasn't similar to the usual staff officers. So Nicholas delegated most of his decision-making powers to Alexeyev. He knew about the existence of Borisov. There are pictures of them together, of Borisov and Nicholas II talking, but I don't think that Nicholas II actually estimated the level of influence that Borisov had on Alexeyev. I personally believe that Borisov and Alexeyev worked together rather than it would have been one-way influence that Borisov influenced Alexeyev. But I think they worked together, and sometimes Alexeyev took the lead, and sometimes, especially in strategic matters and on the Allied matters, Borisov took the lead. And I found some notes that were written half by Borisov, half by Alexeyev. So the Alexeyev began them and Borisov finished. But Nicholas II had nothing to do with it. So he consciously stayed in actual command.
Sort of key duos.
Yes, yes. Yeah. He described himself as Berthier, as if Napoleon general.
Oh, right, yes. So he saw himself in that position, even though officially he had no position.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Derek Williams, who's actually studying the Entente module this year, asked, given Russia went to war originally to protect Serbia, how would you rate their performance on that, and also their effort to support Romania, who didn't last very long when they joined the war?
Well, in terms of helping Serbia, I think Russia obviously failed, but it had to also. But I think it's not because they were unable to send the troops to Serbia, but because they were unable to resolve the munitions crisis, and they were unable to withhold the German advance in summer 1915. And in terms of Romania, actually, Russia knew that they wouldn't be able to help Romania effectively. Again, because of the munitions crisis, because of the manpower crisis. Actually, Russia, despite being the steamroller and having an image of the endless well of manpower, this well by 1916 was already quite exhausted because Russia had very strict conscription laws, and there were lots of exemptions. So they did enlist quite a lot of men, and they began to exhaust their resources by 1916. So I wouldn't rate them very well on this.
Gwendal Pieges has asked, can you elaborate on the relationship between Sazonov and Alexeyev? You mentioned Alexeyev's requests for help from Russian ambassadors. Was this request sent correctly? Yeah, that's a good question. On the diplomats, they were involved in this as well as the soldiers, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, it's quite a good question. Thank you very much, Gwendal, because Alexeyev didn't want to share lots with Sazonov. He saw the diplomats as actually as a nuisance, as a source of potential leak of information, but he wanted to use them as an instrument of his influence. So if he wanted to advocate for a certain idea, he would communicate to Sazonov, but he was very much against of sharing this information with the foreign ministry, and the foreign ministry was trying to get as much info as they could, and they had a diplomatic secretary in Stavka, and Kudashev at the time, and this diplomatic secretary was Sazonov's eyes and ears. So lots of what we know, for instance, the suggestion of a separate piece, we know from Kudashev's letters to Sazonov. So there wasn't an official conversation; it was a personal conversation between between Kudashev and Alexeyev and Kudashev later sent this letter to Sazonov saying that possibly Alexeyev would ask it to do a separate peace with Turkey.
So that suggests that the civil
It never
military
happened.
structures in Russia are rather weak, and there's no central
You see,
coordination.
it's an autocratic power. So everything has to go through Nicholas II. And I think it makes sometimes studying Russian decision-making process in the First World War much easier because they were quite separate. So there was one head of state, and they all had to answer to head of state, and not to the people of Russia, not to Duma. So there was much less influence, especially in the first stages of the war. And since all the power is vested by the sovereign, they were feeling that they are answerable only to the sovereign, and they had non-limited power on military decision making.
Another question from Alexander Pickering, a name you'll remember. What coordination was made with the Russian Navy? How significant was the maritime challenge, moving through the Baltic and the Black Sea, in limiting Russian capability to support alternative theatres?
The coordination with the Navy, I wouldn't say it was very big and significant, because Russian Navy wasn't that big and significant, because it didn't have enough resources. So because Russian Navy was destroyed in the Russo-Japanese War, obviously. So they didn't have enough ships, just simply enough resources to carry out the grand operations they planned for. Therefore, Russia, even before the war, Russian military command opted for a land operations to sort of like attain the major goals of grand strategy, so the straits, and they were arguing that the fate of the straits lies in Vienna and Berlin. So that was their position. And I think it was in a way limiting strategy, especially in the Baltic, more so than in the Black Sea, because Russia was, so the Germany was much stronger enemy for Russia than Austria-Hungary. And Russia was perpetually afraid of the German launching an amphibious operation with the Swedes on the Baltic coast. So they had to keep an army there in the north to prevent from the German invasion, because the Navy was just unable to cover that side. They were trying to, before the war, they were trying to persuade the British to do that for them. But the British said they're not going in the Baltic because they would be trapped there.
Interesting, there were British discussions earlier in the year about forcing their way into the Baltic and linking up with the Russians, which never got anywhere, which might have been a good thing in the long run. But I guess the alternative was to force your way through the Black Sea. That didn't get anywhere either. David, we've got some questions in the chat. David Morgan Owen asks, would you be able to say some more about how the Salonika campaign fitted into the Russo-Ottoman front in the Caucasus?
It's actually, thank you very much for that question, because it's the second idea of Alexeyev. When Salonika idea failed, he was very much on ground offensive. So he suggests that if we can't cut off Turkey by Salonika operation, so cut off Turkey and Bulgaria from Austria and Germany, let's try to just knock the Turkey out. And then he suggested a combined offensive for the British and the Russians from the Caucasus and the British from Alexandretta. It's March 1916. So let's cut across Turkey and knock the Turkey out. That's an interesting suggestion, but it's kind of same logic.
Yeah, another huge thrust into the middle of nowhere. Yes. In the middle of the Turkish desert. I mean, the logic of the Dardanelles campaign is it strikes at the heart of the empire. If you look at your map, all the other campaigns are a long way from anywhere that's going to do serious damage to the Ottoman Empire. I think it is rather fanciful.
Yes, it's just, and for some period of time, it was considered as a real opportunity. It was very brief period of time. I would say about 2 weeks, but it was still like it was considered as an option because it would require less troops, and Russia already had quite a lot of troops in the Caucasus that they could spare, and the Turkish army was not considered to be a significant that much of a. It was not considered to be that much of a threat as the Germans, and if they would knock the Turkey out, then they can use these troops from the Caucasus front somewhere else. So that was the logic behind it.
It's my view, of course, actually, when they did knock Bulgaria out on the Salonika front, that's what obliged Turkey to surrender. The fact that
Yes.
Constantinople was now vulnerable, not the fact that British troops were advancing in Palestine or something like that. So in some ways you have to strike at the heart, which does give you a certain amount of sense to what Borisov is thinking. You strike at the heart of Austria-Hungary, you go for Budapest.
Yeah.
Interestingly, they didn't have a let's break through and go for Berlin. They were very shy of trying to do the same to the Germans.
Yes. Yeah, there was some suggestion about striking to Berlin before the war. So from the Polish salient towards Berlin, and that was what the French were suggesting prior to the war to the Russians. But the Russians were very wary about this. They were very, very, very unsure about the German military power. I mean, they were right. It was much more admirable enemy than Austria-Hungary.
Yes, and they found that in 1915, I think. Another question from Bart Zielinski. Sofia mentioned the Russian reactor to German U-boats in the Black Sea. Could you expand on this and how this might have impacted further Russian military planning?
Effectively, they just paralyzed Russian Baltic fleet. And they paralyzed all the amphibious operations from now on. Even though Russia managed to carry a few amphibious operations against Turkey, but that was a very short kind of, so it was a very short distance that they had to carry the troops out. But with the German submarines in the Black Sea, the idea of amphibious operation against the Straits was dead. So there was, even if it was sometimes was brought up, it was by 1950, by the end of 1915, it was not happening.
Yeah, it's interesting that their ideas in 1915, and they occasionally get a reprise. So the Alexandretta idea of 1916 actually was first mooted before the Dardanelles, but people are starting to pull away from these rather overambitious, fanciful strategies. Yusuf Ozkan is asking, did the outcome of the Dardanelles campaign change Russian views on the capability of the Turkish army in late 1915?
I'm not sure, because they were mostly, so since they were fighting in the Caucasus, I think they were mostly blaming Dardanelles for the Allies' inability to plan appropriately. So they were mostly blaming the Allies rather than praising the Turkish army. But I would say they would definitely think, even not about the fighting techniques, but definitely they knew that the Turkey now had troops to spare after the Allies evacuated from Dardanelles. So they were obviously more aware that the Turkish army has more strength now, mostly by the virtue of evacuating Dardanelles rather than by the fact that they were.
Yeah, I know the next thing. Sorry, yeah, the next thing that happened after the end of the Dardanelles was Kut and further embarrassments in the war in the Middle East and a need to the threat to Egypt reappears. Does the defeat at the Dardanelles essentially allow the Turks to reinforce the Caucasus front and have another offensive campaign there?
Yes. Okay.
Derek, again, in your research, did you pick up any hint of Russia potentially negotiating a separate peace with either Germany or Austria-Hungary? That's a good question, because of course they signed the Treaty of London in 1914 saying no separate peace.
So I'm looking mostly at the military side. So it's Alexeyev and his staff, and I haven't seen anything of the sort at the moment. Even in 1917, so far, I haven't touched 1917 properly yet, but so far from what I have seen, no separate peace, at least in the first half of 1917, no separate peace with Germany or Austria-Hungary, so only Turkey.
It's my understanding the provisional government considered it and rejected the idea.
Yes, yeah. But it's not the military. Military was ready to fight, at least at least the top military, so the commanders and those who were planning, the staff, the headquarters, they were ready to fight, to continue the fight till the very end.
Yes, I think the generals took sides against the Bolsheviks as German puppets in the end. Yeah.
Definitely.
I think we have exhausted our questions. Any final questions for Sophia?
But thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. So,
well, thank you very much, Joe. It's rare we get an insight into the other side of the First World War, and indeed Russian military thinking, particularly one based on detailed Russian archive work. And I'm sure you're going to have lots more insights about other aspects of Russia's war, and I'd welcome you to come back in future and tell us more. We can't give Sophia a round of applause, but we can I can wave my hand. I'm not sure she can see anybody else, but thank you very much, Sophia.
Thank you very much, first of all, and everyone for coming tonight.